Gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Philip Stevens from the Financial Times.
Thank you very
So which
much.
one do you want?
And good evening. Our panel this evening is Confronting Zones of Chaos. So this is the cheerful bit of the weekend. But seriously, if you look around, if you look to the Sahel, parts of the Maghreb, across the Middle East, to my own continent, Europe, Ukraine, it's pretty hard to mistake the emerging zones of chaos. We have conflicts between states, conflicts within states, conflicts across the borders of states. And the question we, I think, confront in this session is whether we face now an era of systemic disorder which is going to disrupt the huge economic progress in the world that we've seen in the past couple of decades. Because when we look at geopolitical conflict, we sometimes forget that it's the best of times as well as the worst of times. Hundreds of millions of people across the world are being lifted out of poverty into education, into better health, into basically a better standard of living. And I think the question we face now is, can these things, geopolitical zones of geopolitical chaos, a sense that there's no one in charge in the world, coexist with this move to human improvement, to greater prosperity? What's the answer? Well, I don't have the answer, but we have an absolutely brilliant panel who in the next 50 minutes or so are going to give you the answer. We have former President Obasanjo from Nigeria. We have Marc Grossman, who I knew in another era as the wisest diplomat in the State Department. He's still a very wise man for Cohen Associates. We have Jorge Castañeda, a former Foreign Affairs Minister for Mexico, now a professor at New York University. And here, we hope, we are going to have Ana Palacio, the former Foreign Minister of Spain, who at this very moment is speeding from Marrakesh Airport to get here on time. Before I turn to the panel, though, we're going to have a very short technological interlude because we're going to have a small opinion poll of you, the participants. 4 questions, easy answers, but if you get your iPads and phones and tablets out, and we'll have the first question. And it's this one. Is this a blip, all these conflicts, or have we indeed entered an era of systemic disorder? And I think you've got 15 or so seconds now to say yes or no. And I can see a little number there that's counting down in that corner. Okay, so what do we think? Hey, yeah. That's pretty close. So I'm clearly, as a European, I'm clearly a pessimist because I thought that number would be a lot higher. So that shows that's different. So just about. Okay, second question. Where do the biggest threats come from? Conflicts between states, transnational threats. We were talking earlier about piracy, but you could add climate change, pandemics there. failing states and international terrorism. We know what's happening in Syria and Iraq. Okay, you can vote now. Okay, so the biggest threats are not conflicts between states. Maybe that's a Pacific phenomena. That's something for the East and South China Seas. The biggest threats we see on the Atlantic side, transnational threats, climate change and pandemics, and the biggest failing states and international terrorism. Okay, the next question. So, the answer to these threats, do we need more global governance? Or have we got enough? If you could say yes or no, and we're counting down. Yes, 60%, but quite a hefty 40% says that we're doing okay. We don't really need a great panoply of transnational governance, but that's interesting. Final question. If you're in the 60%, or even if you're in the 40%, you can answer this. Where should that governance come from? And you can vote now. The G7, the BRICS, the G20, the US, or the UN?
How about none of the above?
Yeah, right. Okay, well, that's interesting. The G7 and the BRICS, they're not really getting there. The G20, which was the great hope, I think, a few years ago, it's not doing too well. The US is still up there above the G7 and the BRICS. And the UN, which a lot of us look at and think, well, it would be great if it worked, but, okay, that's enough. But that's, I think, a really interesting exercise, so thank you very much. And we'll turn now, and I'm going to turn first to President Obasanjo, because I suppose, in a way, that interesting first answer, you know, are we in an era of systemic disorder? If you look at Africa, you see two things. Certainly, an outsider like me, you see a lot of disorder across the continent, north, south, central, but you also see a continent that's prospering mightily, and people who, through their enterprise and endeavor, who are doing extraordinarily well. So is this a sort of coexistence, a state of nature that can continue, or is there a point where the tension will really be felt, and one side, if you like, will have to give?
Thank you very much. Africa, or African countries, are young. They are growing. And normally, with growth, there are missteps, there are difficulties. I will not call what we have chaos. Rather, I will say that we have countries or zones of stability and security difficulty. But this has always been part of living experience of human beings. And what we have in Africa, as African countries grow and improve in their development and human security, they will settle. For instance, 25 years ago, there are about 40 countries in Africa that doesn't know anything about democracy. That has changed. Today, lack of democracy is an aberration rather than a rule. So I don't see this as a permanent feature. I see it as a passing phase that will continue to improve as time goes on, as countries develop, as life improve, livelihood and living conditions of people improve. And one other thing that has come to stay in Africa is the fact that the AU, in its new constitutive act, does not allow impunity. You cannot bring about conflict in your country and treat your own people with impunity. And that, I believe, is good. That is unlike the OAU Charter, which takes whatever you do internally as sacrosanct and which regards boundaries as also sacrosanct. So I see it as a passing phase, and with partnership, with cooperation, with working together internally within Africa, and with particularly along the Atlantic Basin, I see this as something that will soon pass away.
That's a fascinating point that we may come back to later, the idea that Africa is sort of the African Union's enforcing its own responsibility to protect, as it were, on a sort of continental sort of scale rather than a world scale. But can I come back and just ask you one question? You mentioned democracies, and you mentioned, I think, 40 African democracies now. Do you think, because we live in a world where there are competing systems of governments now, a few years ago people might have said the world's about democracies, but now we have more authoritarian states, more autocratic states. Do you think that democracy in Africa is a precondition, if you like, of long-term stability? Or can Africa have different models of governance?
I believe there's no alternative to democracy for us in Africa. Now, there's no monolithic country in Africa. And wherever you have diversity, democracy allows dialogue and debate and discourse, and it allows for people to also have semi-autonomy within the diversity, which we have seen, and it's working. So no other form of government will serve the purpose of Africa. Democracy is not perfect, but it is a form of government that allows for participation by all, and it takes into account the views of all. Of course, at the end of the day, the majority will have its way, but everybody can have his say.
Okay, thank you. Now, I just want to say welcome, Anna Palacio. Thank you for coming straight out of your car from the airport. That's beyond the call of duty, but it's great that you're here. You haven't missed a lot, except I would try to sum up to say, our title is called The Zones of Chaos. I think the participants here are slightly more optimistic about whether this is a systemic problem or a cyclical problem than I was at the beginning. It surprised me. Only about 48% think it's not a systemic problem. The world has a chance of getting through this rough period. Most people thought the answer in terms of global governance was the UN. Nearly 10% still thought the US was the answer in terms of global governance. And that gives me my cue to ask Marc Grossman a question, because a few years ago, there were quite a lot of people around the world saying we've got too much America in this place. That was what time the French talked about the hyperpuissance that was the United States. And people seem to assume that we have this unipolar world in which the Americans would just do what they liked. Going around the place now, I hear even from some countries that are not great friends of the United States, where are the Americans? Why aren't the Americans doing this? Why aren't they guaranteeing this? Why aren't they helping us out on this? You hear it in the Middle East now. I heard an Iraqi not very long ago saying, why aren't the Americans coming back in? We need them. So, have we moved? Has there been this decisive shift from the hyperpuissance to the, if you like, the selective, almost the selfish superpower that's only going to intervene when it wants to and isn't really going to police the global commons anymore?
Well, I don't know whether I'm in the 10% or not, but if you set the standard, Phil, at I have to meet a standard that says we're going to police the global commons, I don't think so. Not alone, and not anytime soon again. Because I think if you look at all the polling in the United States, what do you see? People are exhausted from Iraq. They're exhausted from Afghanistan. But they do not, in any of these polls, say that we should step back from the world entirely. When the questions are asked, should the United States step back now, make our country stronger so that we can again participate as a sensible power in the world? People say, yes, that's what we'd like to do. When the polls say, should the United States continue to lead, for example, in these trade negotiations? The previous panel talked about the TTIP and the TTP. Yes, people in the United States say. I think there has been a big shift in American public opinion as the president has moved with a very large coalition against ISIS or ISIL, whichever you prefer to call it. And when you talk about a selfish superpower, I don't think the act of sending American forces to help out on the Ebola crisis is an act of selfishness at all. So I don't think that's the answer to this question. I think a lot of Americans are trying to debate for themselves the first question that you put up there. What we face here is a systemic set of disorders. And I think you get a couple of answers to that. First is, I think, the answer that Henry Kissinger is putting out in this new book, World Order, which I've been kind of working my way through, which is to say there is a systemic problem in the sense that there are now different visions, as you say, of world order. There's a Western vision, you might consider it, based on the Westphalian system. There's a different vision in Russia. There's a different vision from Iran. There's a different vision in China. And so there is a debate in the world about what constitutes order. And the second thing I think is interesting, as Americans over the past 5 or 10 years have thought about their own diplomacy and their own role in the world, was very much like a lot of the conversation in the previous panel. How do you deal with climate change? How do you deal with transnational threats? How do you deal with the trafficking in human beings? And American diplomacy started to look at those as a focus of attention. But what does that have to say to an Assad, to a Putin who acts as he did in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, to questions, as you put it, in the South China Sea? So there's a balancing act here between kind of a new kind of 21st century diplomacy, an outlook that I think many Americans would like to have, and yet a diplomacy that has to deal with these very hard problems that are out there in the world.
But, okay, just to push you one little bit, I said selfish. I could have said, I mean, in a way, all countries pursue their national interests. Talking as many as I do and others do, other journalists do, to people in the administration now, they say, look, we take a much narrower view of our national self-interest than we did perhaps 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's a fair judgment?
I think people are taking a narrower view of what action, especially military action, they'll take to pursue the national interest. I don't think you take a different view of the national interest. You're looking for different ways to pursue it.
Okay, but I think we might come back as well in the discussion to the extent to which, if the United States isn't the sort of global police force, as it were, it can lead coalitions or to do that. But first I want to move on to Jorge Castañeda. You saw the list of, when we talk about global governance, most people still want the UN. Not many people seemed impressed by the BRICS. I think it was only 16 or 17% who thought the G20 was going to be the answer. Where do you think the answer, as between these different groups, or perhaps combinations of these groups, lie? Because the other thing we saw there was that people think that transnational threats, whether it's terrorism or whether it's Ebola or climate change, are the big problems facing us.
Well, I don't know what the big problems are in which priority, but I think there's a systemic issue in that the ordering principle of post-World War II relations, which was the Cold War and bipolar rivalry, disappeared exactly 25 years ago, this month, this week, or next week, whenever. And we really haven't built anything up in its place. So what we have in its place is not multipolarity. That's a lot of nonsense. There's one big one and a bunch of other little guys. Now, the little guys can have a lot of people in them, but that does not make them real actors, real new people on the block. Chinese, the Indians, etc. What I think that means is that in order to reach the stage where we have new ordering principles, we're going to have to go through an intermediate period, which is going to look something like the UN plus the US. The BRICS, I've thought for many years, can't hack it. They are not ready for prime time. None of them are truly world or even regional powers. The best example, we've been talking about it, colleagues, the last couple of days about Brazil. I won't say what the Brazilians think, but I'll say what I think, and they tend to agree, or these Brazilians do. Brazil does not have even a regional role, much less an international role. The Indians are in a similar position. The South Africans are in a similar position. So the BRICS are not going to fill this. The G20 is a sort of discussion club. They talk. And then they love the lateral stuff, G-Think and G-This and G-Business. They love all of that stuff. But it really is just a way to visit different watering holes all over the world, which I'm very envious of, frankly. But in any case, just to conclude on this, it's got to be the UN, because there's nothing else. But it can't be just the UN. And the only country that can establish some sort of order somewhere by leading from behind, by leading from in front, by taking the initiative, by pushing others to take it, is the United States. It's the only truly global power around. That's the reality of the world situation.
Before I come on to Anna, though, but can I just press you? You said it's got to be the UN and the US, but surely the UN and the US requires the consent of, I'd never heard the Chinese called little guys before.
A lot of guys, but little guys. Yes, they're a bit like the Brazilians, diplomatic dwarfs.
But surely the UN and US formulation demands the consent of the Chinese and the Russians, and they don't seem, they don't seem to want to buy into this responsible stakeholder stuff that used to be around a little while ago.
I mean, this is the problem the U.S. has faced for now many years, which is it really only likes to act through the UN or conceivably NATO, but that's not great. And it can't always or rarely can find a way to act through the UN. Libya was one. That was about it. Syria's been much more complicated, and the rest is even more complicated. Thank God it couldn't act through the UN on Iraq, but it tried. It just wasn't able to. But there's a real problem there. The U.S. cannot act alone. The UN cannot act alone. One without the other doesn't work.
Okay. Anna, I hope you've managed to catch a little breath.
Right.
Because now I'm going to be rude about the Europeans,
Wow.
about my own continent as well. Because, I remember, 10, 15 years ago, people writing books about how Europe was going to be the model for the world, how this sort of postmodern system of integration was going to be the model for the world. Now, some of us look at our own continent and say, can we hold together, let alone export this model for the rest of the world? And you look at what's happening in Ukraine. So what's the European contribution to confronting zones of chaos elsewhere, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in the Middle East, if it can't really handle things on its own continent anymore?
Well, I think that the European Union, as such, just is an epitome of what's going on in the world. It has been said that this is not a systemic crisis. Well, if it's not the systemic crisis, the clock is ticking.
50-50.
It's ticking for the systemic crisis. And what it proves, and I fully agree with what has just been said about the UN, what underlies the challenge is law as an instrument to organize societies, to organize communities, to organize relations. And what we prove by our crisis in the European Union is that this project, that is a project based on law and by law, is losing speed. We don't agree, but we don't agree on the big things, and we don't agree on even minor, it's not minor, but let me say, not just on big treaty changes or constitutional advancements, just as, for instance, fiscal union or energy union. No, it's that you take, for instance, let me just give you an example, and I'm sure that you know that. The audit package. So the European Union has legislated about audit in the European Union, and we have a directive and we have a regulation. Regulation, according to the treaty, is a legal instrument that is directly applicable, so it's uniform for all the Union. Well, you have 26 articles where there are options for the member states, which means that there is no harmonization, that the harmonization is purely silver plating, which means that there is a crisis of law and institutions, because institutions in the legal sense. I don't call the G20 an institution because it doesn't have a statute, it doesn't have rules to institute it. And I mean, it's true that it's mostly a talk shop, it's true, but they decided, the G20 conclusions decided that the Europeans should give up 2 positions in the IMF and the World Bank boards. I mean, I fully agree with the idea, but what I don't agree is that it's a different body. The World Bank and the IMF have their rules to reach this decision. It's not for a different body to dictate that the IMF and the World Bank have to take a certain decision, because this just undermines the basic essence of all this. And of course, this goes beyond. And I think that this idea that we need the UN plus the US, I fully agree. The problem is that beyond what has been said, there is another challenge for you Americans, and I don't have to prove my Atlanticism, because it's there. But the US has always had, I would say, mixed feelings towards the international law. Either the US negotiates and doesn't sign, or negotiates, signs and doesn't ratify. And of course, if the UN should understand that, because what is challenged now is the basic threads of the system, which is law. The US should understand that it's in the interest. The exceptionalism of the US that has been at the core of this idea that I may negotiate, but maybe I sign, I don't sign, it's just contrary to the deep interest of the US. But the US has not yet realized that it is in its interest, that international law is now in the interest of the US.
Well, look, that's great. Now, I could stand up here and ask questions for another hour or so and have fun, but this is your session. So we're going to open it up, and we've had some really good points made. I was thinking of, again, on President Obasanjo's point about the African Union, about whether we should be thinking now in terms not just of global governance, but more effective regional governance, and regions of the world looking after themselves in cooperation, if we can't get the UN, for example, working at the top level. But I now would like you, the participants, to offer your thoughts, comments, arguments, debates, and if no one puts their hands up quickly, I'm going to start pointing at people, but I see a lady just there.
Hello, my name is Fatim Baji, and I'm from the Gambia. I just wanted to refer back to one of the guiding questions, which is, what do you think are the driving factors for the chaos? And looking at Africa in particular, where recently we've had the cases of Boko Haram, I wanted to find out whether it's important to have an intelligence group that would investigate and also tackle down some of the emerging chaos that we have with intelligence. Thank you.
I'm going to take 3 or 4 questions and then come back and ask you to pick the ones that you think most appropriate to address. So there was one there. And one there.
Anton Aguadi of The Economist. To follow up my colleague's question on Boko Haram, I was interested in President Obasanjo saying, I'm here, sir, saying that he thought there wasn't chaos, it was merely areas of security concern. I mean, given what's happening in Borno State, given the fact that the Nigerian army, which had been seen as a pillar of security in West Africa, a whole battalion broke and escaped to Cameroon under attack, what does it tell us about the state of Nigeria? And to the rest of the panel, do you see an arc of instability that's interconnected, running from the Sahel, from Nigeria, all the way out to Somalia, or do you see these as all separate, discrete conflicts? Thank you.
Okay, and this gentleman here, and then this gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Justin Guest. I'm a professor at George Mason University. I was thinking that bringing and connecting on one of the topics that came up in our last conversation in the plenary about the role of development and cooperation for immigration purposes and how difficult it is to see cooperation from the north, from destination countries, to promote the economies in the south rather than build walls and build security complexes. And because I think of, when we look on the map, we see sort of Europe's Rio Grande, the Strait of Gibraltar. I wonder if La Señora Palacio could address why it's so hard to convince a country to build relationships with the global south rather than build walls, because the money's being spent either way.
Okay, fine. And then I'll take this one and then we'll come back. This gentleman here in the front.
Hello, I'm Landry Signé from Cameroon. Thank you very much for a fantastic panel. I would like to first begin with President Obasanjo. You were one of the founding fathers of the New Partnership for Africa Development, one of the most ambitious development projects for Africa in the 21st century. And one of the key factors when NEPAD was launched was the notion of security and fixing the failed state. About 12 or 14 years after the creation of NEPAD, we see that Africa still has more failed states even perhaps than in 2001. So what are your ideas on how will you explain these negative evolutions? The second question is related to the world order. So we're speaking about the United Nations, the United States, and perhaps one element to take into consideration are the factors which are shaping the foreign policies, especially of leading power. And we think about power, principle, prosperity, or peace. So when putting those factors together, is it realistic to think that the United Nations can lead the world or can act as a structural factor, or will we see the emergence of numerous regional hegemons rather than a global power? Thank you.
Okay, so we've got a series of great questions, starting with Boko Haram, the question of whether we now see this arc of chaos running from West Africa right through this region, through the Middle East. The question, good question I've always thought as a European, why aren't we buying more stuff from the Maghreb rather than building fences against these countries? Two questions on Africa. Why has Africa got, well, apart from the Boko Haram ones, why has Africa still got all these failed states? And I've probably forgotten something, but the panel will remember if I have. So why don't we start? Well, we'll start. Do you have any thoughts on any of those? You don't don't take all of them. Just take
two,
the ones.
and very quickly, the walls or bridges. I mean, of course, I agree. Not only in the case of Spain and Morocco and Africa, but in the case of the United States and Mexico and Central America, it's a huge mistake to build walls unless you make doors in the walls and you open the doors, which sometimes is a good idea. But you have to put the doors in. And neither the Europeans nor the Americans seem to be willing to do this, which doesn't mean it doesn't happen. In other words, if if the Europeans or the Spanish or the Italians or the Americans had the choice, do they want people coming from Africa and from Mexico and from Central America or not? The answer would be no, or only as many as we want, when we want them, where we want them, and the kind we want. That's not going to happen. So in the real world, these countries are not really going to face up to it. On the question of realistic, I just simply insist again, the UN alone is not realistic. The US alone is not realistic. And none of the other groups are institutions, like Anna said. So this is what we've got. We don't have a whole lot more, and we haven't come up with anything better. Okay. And the regional things, I mean, are either non-existent or sort of jokes.
Okay, Anna, just on the same, on that same subject,
well,
why are we, we promised a lot after the Arab Spring uprisings began, and we don't really seem to have delivered.
Well, frankly, on this, we have a flawed neighborhood policy. We have this preconceived idea that everybody around the European Union want to be like us, and like us to all extremes, which is not true. We have to accept this diversity, and you cannot have one size fits all. The eastern border, the southern border, and countries absolutely different. But let me just give 3 figures. Why? Why is there this difference between Rio Grande and the 2 sides of the Mediterranean? Well, the difference in GDP per capita, depending on what you take into account, is 2 or 3 times bigger in the Mediterranean than in Rio Grande. That's the first thing. The second figure is that, in my opinion, what we need to understand is that aid, in the traditional sense of official aid to development, is 10 times smaller than direct investment. What we have to create is the conditions for foreign direct investment to thrive in this, which means legal security, which means security tout court, so physical security and legal security. And last, in Spain, Spain is an emigration country until the mid-80s. In 15 years, we have around 14% of our population that is foreign-born. Some are already Spaniards, some do not have yet the nationality. And we have more than 1 million Moroccans in Spain, which means that the doors exist. We have a flawed policy, absolutely clear. We should be able to do much more than we do with the same instruments, not more instruments, with the same instruments, if these instruments were just geared in the right sense. But I think that we have a new commission, we have a new parliament, and we have to be optimistic, at least in a Kantian sense. We need to be optimistic and believe that they will make it.
Okay. President Obasanjo, you had faced a couple of quite tough questions, I think.
3 points I quickly want to deal with that have come out. AU and UN. I will agree that the UN should give more governance to the world. But what you are saying, it should be UN +1. What happened to UN +5? The the
Security Council.
What do you call them?
Security Council P5.
The not only just Security Council, but the veto powers.
Yeah. Permanent members.
Then what happened to UN +15, the Security Council? I would say that if we really want to get a government the way you want it, it should be UN +5. Now, of course, in the UN +5, the US will lead. But if you keep the other veto powers out, they will veto everything that you do. And we must bear that in mind. Now, for us in Africa, we have to be strong at home before we ask for this big umbrella of the UN+1 or UN+5. And that is what we are doing. Now, when we had to intervene in Liberia, it was, in fact, ECOWAS, the West African sub-region, that did it. The rest of the international community said, look, we will have our ship along the shore. We will be watching how you are doing it. And that's what happened. In Sierra Leone, it was the same thing. And yes, you are right. Sierra Leone was almost a failed state. But it was the effort of Africa that brought it back and is today a viable state, except Ebola. Liberia is the same. And even South Sudan, that is the newest state, had the problem that it had on the 15th of December last year. AU intervened by establishing an AU Commission of Inquiry to find out who committed human rights violation, how it was committed, and all that. Even with genocide in Rwanda, AU or OAU did not raise a finger. So we are making progress. And what we are saying is, let us be strong at home, and then we will be able to be open to the type of the world governance. But let me talk about Boko Haram. Boko Haram, some people said it is a menace waiting to happen. And why is this? The northeastern part of Nigeria, where you have Boko Haram, it is the least developed part of Nigeria. Compared with the southwest or southeast, they are 4 times less developed than those. So for that reason, Boko Haram was regarded as a menace to happen. And the poor action on the part of the government, of the military, is simply because there was substantial empathy, if not sympathy, for Boko Haram. And that everybody knows. And it's issue of motivation and morale. The morale was low, the motivation was not there, but to deal with Boko Haram, it must be an issue of stick and carrot. If we follow stick alone, we will fail. If we follow carrot alone, we will fail. It has to be a mixture of stick and carrot. And that is the example of Colombia is something that we can learn from.
Oh, fascinating. Marc.
Let me just
Is
try.
Colombia an example?
That's right. That's right. Let me just try to make a couple of comments. I know time is short. First, I thought if I could come back to your question about kind of what are the causes of all of this disorder, because I think that's a very important one. I think that it's 2 slices. One is it's a lot of the things that the previous panel talked about. It's the transnational threats. It says people voted for failed states, terrorism. I think there's a lot of leftover from the economic crisis, 2008, 2009. It's the disruptions in technology. So all of these things seems to me kind of are a cause of this disorder. What, in my view, I vote with the slightly majority here, whether this is systemic or not, what makes it verges to me on the systemic is that those individual causes get connected to this debate about what kind of order. Right? Who runs the order? Who establishes the order? Who enforces the order? And out there today, there's no answer to that question because countries like Russia and China and Iran and other countries as well question the order that we have. So I think it's 2 things. It's the set of circumstances that we have, it's events, combined with what seems to me a systemic question of what kind of order. Secondly, on the question of arcs, my view is I think putting names on things kind of in the end doesn't do you any good. But clearly there's a huge relationship between what's going on in one country all across that area, as you said, from the Sahel to Somalia, and it's the interconnections of the things that you had just talked about, all of the events plus the question of governance and order. Third, and that is on the question that the professor asked about development. I guess when I look back, was trying to think the other day about, what did I learn in a career in this for 30, 32 years, which is the fact that I think that there's less and less and less an effective role for official development assistance, and exactly as Minister Palacio said, and as Minister Castañeda said, it's about the private sector, and it's about jobs, and it's about giving opportunities. When the minister and I worked together on Colombia, what did we learn? We could employ many, many, many more people by opening up markets than we ever could thinking about aid. But it goes back also to something that the minister said, which is that it's all then based upon the rule of law. When you make a presentation to corporate governance, any of the corporate governance represented in this room, not just Americans, what do they want to know? They want to know, is there rule of law in this country? Do I have a chance to prevail in court? Can I make a living there? And so the rule of law is, I think, intimately connected to the possibilities of foreign direct investment and ultimately of the private sector. And then finally on the United Nations. If the President would allow me just to expand his point a little bit, you have, it seems to me, in the Security Council, a very important body that still lives in 1945. And so as the President said, a United Nations Security Council that was expanded in some way to better reflect the truth about the relationships of power and influence in the world today might have more legitimacy and might be able to play a more important role.
Okay. Now, I was expecting a sort of wrap-up cue, but I haven't had it, and it's a great conversation. So as long as everyone promises to run for the buses, we'll take a couple more from the floor. And this gentleman here, and then the gentleman right at the very back up there. I'm sorry. This gentleman, sorry, down here. Sorry, it was here. And then right at the very back, we're just going to take these two, and then our great panelists will have 1 minute each.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panelists. My name is Dapo Iwale. I'm from Nigeria. And if you look at the demographics, the world is getting younger. If you also look at the patterns of chaos that we're seeing today, I can't help but feel that increasingly when you look at the Arab Spring, look at what's happening in Hong Kong, young people everywhere seem dissatisfied with leadership. They seem dissatisfied with the status quo. I had the pleasure of speaking to the Atlantic Dialogue's emerging group, leaders group today. Passionate, committed, hardworking young people. And I can't help but get a sense that young people are tired of waiting. They're tired of emerging. They want to emerge. So my question to the panel is that, do you think there are increasingly generational dimensions to the kind of chaos and conflict that we see today? And do you think it's because young people want to have a greater destiny, control over their destinies, control over their countries, and control over the world they live in?
Great question, really good question. And the gentleman right at the back.
Hello, I'm Rupert Joy. I'm the European ambassador here in Morocco. One thing that struck me in recent years, both as a British diplomat and now as a European diplomat, is that we, and I suppose by we I mean the Western community of nations, are struggling really to articulate a vision of how we think the world should be. Because the crises seem to absorb so much of everyone's attention all the time that nobody seems able to get very much beyond the reacting to the crises. And I don't know whether this is a common experience, but it's something that has very much struck me. And I suppose my question really is, how do we, in confronting what appears to be a growing sense of chaos, how do we deal with all these challenges? The challenges of 51 million refugees, the most since the Second World War, the challenges of migration caused by so many different factors, the challenges of a whole series of different chaotic situations, and at the same time, try to find a more coherent way of looking ahead, of being preemptive and proactive rather than reactive through the institutions, the international institutions that we have.
Okay, another great question. Two great questions. One, is this, if you like, partly a rebellion of young people who are fed up with establishments and don't want to wait anymore? And secondly, does an exhausted West any longer have the capacity to try to deal with some of these chaotic parts of the world? Why don't we'll start with President Obasanjo, and then we'll go from there.
Let me take Africa. The youth in Africa are angry, they are bitter, they feel frustrated, they feel denied by leaders, especially when they have no job. 60% of our youth are jobless, unemployed. The other problem is that most of them are unemployable. They have no skill that can really give them employment within the industry, the existing industry. And they see impunity, corruption, poor governance. So what is the way out? The way out is improvement in governance. We have to make very great effort to really create massive employment, not just tinkering with it. And we have to remove impunity. Most of the things, and these young people, they are really, really frustrated and angry. If we do that, and how can we create more jobs? We have to provide conducive environment for domestic investment and foreign investment. My own understanding is that the money is there, capital is there. The capital will only go to where it can be secure, safe, and can yield very comfortable return.
Great, thank you. Jorge Castañeda.
On the youth part, I mean, I agree, both obviously the president and the gentleman who asked the question, that yes, the people in the streets and the people rebelling and the people bringing down authoritarian regimes do tend to be young, and they tend to do all of this for the reasons President Obasanjo said. The problem is that the next step doesn't generally follow. Remember, we've been seeing youth movements in the Western countries in Latin America now, at least since 1968, and a lot of us have been through these over the years. And yes, youth rebels, and then, for all sorts of reasons, many of them good reasons, that rebellion does not translate into more youth participating in politics. Once the rebellion is over, we move back again to a situation, I wouldn't say of apathy, but a certain passivity, whether it's voting, whether it's running for office, whether it's getting involved in civil society, any of these issues. Most of the time, these generational rebellions do not translate into greater participation by young people in politics.
I'm going to get in real trouble if we don't wrap up quickly. So, at a Palacio, Marc, Grossman, very quickly, 30 seconds each. Is an exhausted West, does it just now lack the capacity to try to deal with one of those things? Anna first, well, and then Marc. But I mean, we has
honestly,
to be 30
I
seconds.
think that the clock is ticking, because this system, we have a vision. The vision of the European Union is this idea that you can overcome feuds and differences by negotiation, by the rule of law. This is the vision. There's a multilateral rules-based multilateral institution-based. So this is the vision. But let me just say one sentence about the youth. I think there is a big difference between African youth and what we have seen in Hong Kong. African youth, they felt humiliated. There was a lack of dignity. Their life, it's not just a quest for democracy, like in Hong Kong. It's a quest for dignity of life, for making a living, for having the possibility to have a family and to put some food on the plate of the family. And I think that this makes a big difference. But, and this is my last sentence, I think that the future belongs to Africa because of the youth. Because in a world that will be aging and losing steam, Africa is the only continent that will be the reservoir of youth. And once there's, and I think that what President Obasanjo said about this quest for democracy, that among all this there is a push for democracy in Africa. And why is the Atlantic Basin meaningful? It's because this idea of law, of institutions, is what is at the bottom line.
Thank you, Marc Grossman.
All right, 30 seconds. In 30 seconds, I just have to agree with the rest of the panel, sir, on the question of youth. I'd like to go back to the ambassador's question. Two things, sir. One, I think you've got to expand now the definition of diplomacy to try to take in both the 21st century threats and those that might be atavistic but have come back and certainly will be 21st century threats going forward. And then just to follow up on the points that I think the rest of the panel made here. One of the things that really has bothered me or troubles me over the past few years is that we have become, I think, as Western, as representatives, to be a little bit afraid to speak out for some of the kinds of values that the minister talked about. And I don't think that it's at all wrong to look at people and say, what is it that we believe? We believe that successful 21st century societies will value the rule of law, the sanctity of the individual, the role of women in society, and the capacity of people to make choices about their own lives. People can organize themselves any way they want, but I don't think there's any shame in reminding people that those are four really important points of our own consensus.
Thank you. I think it's been a brilliant panel, so I think we should say thank you and then run for the buses.
And again, I'm going to add my voices to Philip's in thanking all of the panelists and also thanking Phil Stevens for doing a terrific job moderating. The only point I'm going to disagree with him on is I don't want anyone to run to the buses. I do want you to walk with purpose to the buses because we do need to immediately move to the dinner venue. So thanks so much.
Hi, thank you.